Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Klassen, and I'm here with my colleague Tetsuya Fukuda from International Christian University. And we're going to share with you today the results from a cluster analysis we did using test scores, test familiarity, and preparation in order to learn more about our students' learning gains. A bit of background to the study. What we're going to talk about today is the latest installment of an ongoing study looking at the differences in proficiency test scores after 1 year in an intensive English program at a small private university in Tokyo. The overarching aim of the whole study is to identify the factors or the combination of factors that contribute to student success in our program. And we hope to use these results in order to drive our program design and development, and of course, to support potentially less successful students in the year that they are with us. Some prior research findings in this ongoing study include this interesting finding from Erdely and colleagues. One finding was that the number of classes taken was a predictor of proficiency gains, while study abroad was not. And so students in our program, depending upon which stream they're placed on, they take a different number of classes. So when they took more classes, they learned more. That might seem obvious, but that was a nice finding. And it's perhaps especially important that study abroad isn't always necessary, especially in these last 2 years where people haven't been able to study abroad due to COVID. Yagi and Fukuda conducted a survey and interviews, and they found a lot of variation among both successful and less successful students in terms of their motivation, how much they prepared for the exit tests, and their study abroad experience. So because of that large variation in the data, for this current study, we were using cluster analysis in order to find new ways of grouping our participants, maybe looking at them in a way that we hadn't done yet. So let me explain a little bit what cluster analysis is. It's a multivariate exploratory procedure, and it's especially useful when your data is suggesting that you do have a lot of variation in the subgroups or participants. For example, in second language acquisition, you might see a lot of variation in motivation or learning strategies, aptitudes, for example. And that is what our data was suggesting. And so cluster analysis has a potential to offer more insight into the individual differences than traditional statistical techniques that we normally see in SLA studies. And so in that way, cluster analysis can be used as a complementary analysis to what you're already doing. And while cluster analysis isn't very common in SLA studies, its use is increasing, in particular to explore individual differences. So I'd like to give you one example of how cluster analysis can be used as a complementary analysis. Gu and Johnson were investigating vocabulary learning strategies and learning outcomes. And they had a questionnaire asking participants about their beliefs and their approaches to vocabulary learning. They also had general English proficiency scores. And in addition to that, they had vocabulary test scores. And they actually had a larger sample size than this, but this number here was the number that they used the cluster analysis for. So they did employ more traditional techniques like correlational analysis on the strategies and the test scores. And then they also perform multiple regression to determine the best predictors. And then at that point, in the final step of their analysis, they use cluster analysis to group their participants according to strategy use and learning outcomes. So what they found from their cluster analysis was 5 distinct groups. So the groups were all distinct in terms of what kind of vocabulary strategies they used and their proficiency gains. And because there was no statistically significant variation among the 5 groups, Gu and Johnson were able to conclude that the differences in vocabulary size and proficiency were a function of their beliefs and strategy use, and not on their initial proficiency levels when they entered the university. So cluster analysis does have some potential. So we were interested to see how we could employ it in our study. So now I'll pass you over to Dr. Fukuda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klassen. So in our study, 67 first-year undergraduate students participated. They are all students who entered the university in spring 2019, and they took TOEFL ITP as an entrance test in April 2019, and they took IELTS as an exit test in March 2020. After the IELTS exam, I sent the link to the Google form to 267 students, and we got the results. We got responses from 67 students. So in this study, we had these 6 factors. TOEFL scores at the beginning of the English program, IELTS scores at the end, and the student responses to the 4 Likert scale questionnaires. In the survey, we asked these questions in 5-point Likert scale question items. But we decided to incorporate the responses to these questions in our analysis. They are about students' preparation for TOEFL and IELTS, and their previous experiences of taking these exams. This table shows the descriptive statistics of the 6 factors in this study. The mean score of the TOEFL is about 513, which is equivalent to 65 in TOEFL IBT and 600 in TOEIC. And the mean of IELTS is 6.2, which is equivalent to 70 to 80 in TOEFL IBT and 650 or above in TOEIC. So the students generally improved their English proficiency over the year of the English intensive course. As for the survey results, the preparation levels varied, but we should pay attention to the low means for TOEFL and IELTS experience. Some students had taken TOEFL before they took it in April, but almost everyone said they had never taken IELTS before. Since we use different numbers for these factors, we standardized the scores, and the following data show that these scores. In order to find the optimal number of clusters to analyze, we used the so-called elbow method. The y-axis shows the number of clusters, and the y-axis represents the total within sum of a square. The elbow curve method shows how increasing the number of clusters contribute separating the clusters in a meaningful way. We should look for the place of elbow, which means the place where the line becomes flat. It looks like the line becomes flat when the number of clusters is 5, and again when it is 10. Considering the small number of participants, we decided to have 5 clusters in this analysis. This figure shows the dendrogram of this study. The numbers in the far left show the participant numbers for this study. Those participants were grouped or clustered in a meaningful way. Based on this analysis, we will look at the 5 clusters and their characteristics. This graph shows the mean scores of the 6 factors in each cluster. The y-axis shows the 6 factors in this study, and the y-axis shows the z-scores of the means of each cluster. The dark blue line shows group 1. The students in this group prepared for IELTS as much as other students, but their scores were lower than the general population by 0.5 standard deviation. Group 2 is represented by the orange line. Those students had average scores for the 2 tests. They prepared for TOEFL, but they didn't prepare for IELTS. Group 3 is represented by the gray line. Those students' scores for both of the tests were low, but they had taken TOEFL before. Group 4 is represented by this yellow line. The 2 scores were high, but they did not prepare for the test. Group 5 is represented by this light blue line. Their 2 scores were low, but they had taken IELTS before. Okay. So, because 29 analysis demonstrated potential for useful information, we repeated the analysis on the 2020 cohort, and we were lucky enough to collect the data from 183 students this time. In this study, we only had IELTS as exist test scores because we did not have any TOEFL test due to COVID-19 situation. We asked the participants about the preparation for the IELTS test and also the familiarity with the test. In addition to that, we also asked how motivated they were to use a test score for their future. We call this perceived future need. This line graph shows the representation of each of the clusters. So here in the x-axis, we only have 4 factors this time. There are IELTS test scores, their preparation levels, and the prior experience, and their motivation to use a score for their future study. And the y-axis shows the z-standardized scores. This table shows the same information as in the line graph. In group 1, the students had taken IELTS before and did not prepare for the test. Their score was high, and they are interested in studying abroad. In group 2, the students did not prepare for the test, but the score was average. They are not interested in studying abroad. In group 3, the students prepared a lot without prior experiences. The score was not very high, but they are interested in studying abroad. The students in group 4 are interested in studying abroad, and other factors are kind of average. In group 5, the student score was the lowest, but they prepared for the test and they are interested in studying abroad. And in group 6, the score was the highest, but they did not prepare much, and they are not so much interested in studying abroad.
Okay, so on the 2020 cohort analysis, then we did find some interesting results that we would not have gotten from other analyses. For example, over a third of the participants, represented by clusters 2 and 6, they didn't prepare a lot for the test. They weren't familiar with the test, and they didn't really see a future need for it either. So to us, that's interesting, because we want to know then what is their motivation for taking a test that is quite a lengthy test like the IELTS. Another interesting finding was that almost a quarter of the students, they saw a really high need for this test score, but yet they didn't prepare a lot and they weren't very familiar with it. So to us, that's important, because this obviously suggested that we can do more to support them to prepare for this test, help them become familiar with the resources that they can access in our program. And then yet another finding was represented by clusters 3 and 5. They did prepare a lot, but they had the lowest test scores. Now, we can't really draw any conclusions there because we only had the one test score, so we're not looking at learning gains. But that's what we would like to investigate next, is when we're not constrained by how many tests we have, we would like to investigate more about the learning gains that students make in our program using the cluster analysis. So our conclusions today are that cluster analysis can reveal important information that you might not be able to get through other standard analyses. It is useful for categorizing or maybe recategorizing your learners in a meaningful way. Of course, if you decide to use cluster analysis, it's going to depend on the factors that you want to look at, how many factors you want to look at, and of course the number of participants. And it's quite an open analysis that way. It has lots of potential. For us, future research is going to use cluster analysis again, and as I mentioned, this time we want to look at the learning gains, and we want to add that to our analysis next year. So thank you very much for your attention today. Our email addresses are here if you would like to send us some comments or questions. And then our references are on the last slide here. If you are interested in doing cluster analysis, please have a look at the Staples and Viber chapter in the Plonsky Quantitative Methods Handbook. Very useful. And thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.